Hello and welcome to episode 5 of our journey through William Shakespeare's Macbeth. Last time we saw how the tremendous power of the supernatural had already begun to corrupt our eponymous tragic hero. We heard that Macbeth would become king, but that Banquo's sons would also take the throne. Today, as we look at Act 1, Scene 4, we will hear how tremendously grateful Duncan is that Macbeth and Banquo led his armies in battle, completely unaware that one of his great generals is contemplating committing regicide. A reminder on annotation: I will be annotating general plot points in green, contextual factors in blue, and writer's craft in red. Duncan's sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, are introduced. And Duncan is all business. Immediately he checks that the Thane of Cawdor has been put to death. Execution was the standard punishment for any treacherous activity in this period. There's a lot of tension building in this scene, and this is the start of it. We know that Macbeth is contemplating the most treacherous act of all, and we now know what his punishment will be if he is caught. Malcolm confirms that the Thane is dead. He also goes into some detail about the events that led up to the execution. The Thane confessed all of his sins and begged for forgiveness, a possible attempt at reaffirming the natural order before his judgment came. He begs for God's forgiveness after betraying him and his chosen ruler, King Duncan. He is then executed, with Shakespeare foreshadowing Macbeth's potential future, showing us that although redemption may be possible, nothing can save the life of a traitor, not even confession and an apology. Duncan addresses the idea of appearance and reality here. You can never tell what is going on in a man's mind. He can lie to you and pretend to be something he is not. Ironic from Shakespeare here, as Duncan appears to be making the same mistakes again. Then we've got some explicit foreshadowing of Macbeth's potential betrayal. The former Thane of Cawdor was a gentleman who Duncan trusted absolutely, and he betrayed him. Macbeth then enters the scene immediately on this point, making it an even more powerful statement. Duncan addresses Macbeth as a worthy person again. We've seen that word used to describe both him and the previous Thane of Cawdor. The repetition of it now links them together at a time where MacDonald's execution for betraying the king is being discussed. We also know that Macbeth is considering following MacDonald's treacherous path. Following that, Duncan has an exaggerated monologue where he praises Macbeth's performance in battle. He's treating Macbeth with reverence here, showing a deep respect and love. Could this potentially be another instance of using Duncan to show James in a positive light, maybe? Is Duncan praising Macbeth so highly because he is more man than Duncan is, in terms of his bravery and his valour? If so, it certainly makes Duncan look weak. Firstly, he states that he feels guilty for not thanking Macbeth enough. Shakespeare then employs dramatic irony to really make Duncan look naive and potentially foolish. He claims that no prize he could give to Macbeth would be enough reward for his bravery. The audience know that there is only one reward that Macbeth really wants. That is the kingship that Duncan holds. And we know the lengths that Macbeth is willing to go to seize that reward. Macbeth responds with duplicity. He's openly lying to the king and therefore to God. He claims that serving Duncan is the only reward that he needs. And the audience, we know that he is lying. They have heard his inner thoughts through his asides that Shakespeare's used so cleverly. And then Macbeth shows how strong his patriotism is. There's an element of truth here. He's just risked his life for his country, but stating that the throne demands his loyalty is incredibly ironic, considering the actions that the audience know he is planning to take against that throne. Shakespeare layers the irony on now. Duncan then discusses the proud and prosperous future that he is planning for Macbeth. He has just made him the Thane of Cawdor, and more riches and titles appear to be promised in the future. Duncan will ensure that he's generally successful. But the audience, again, we know Macbeth's true thoughts. The audience know that he's planning his own prosperous future at Duncan's expense. And then we're really building a contrast now, and there's some sort of conflict building between Macbeth and Banquo, stemming from the meeting with the witches. Banquo's praise is just as high as Macbeth's is, but his reaction is the absolute opposite. And then this contrast is shown again. Banquo's loyalty to Duncan is sincere. Macbeth's obviously isn't. Duncan's just really happy now. He's reflecting on the tough times that Scotland has overcome. The battle was violent and grueling. Many lives were lost, but they came out as victors, and the country is stronger and more united as a result of that. Ironic. Lots and lots and lots of irony in this scene. But to be fair to Duncan, it's no wonder that he's so excited. He then names his heir, Malcolm, the Prince of Cumberland. Malcolm is Duncan's son, so naturally he would succeed him as king. This is just a dramatic device. And obviously it's a real problem for Macbeth. It also adds some jeopardy to the witch's prophecies for the first time. Macbeth and the audience have seen how quickly and easily he became Thane of Cawdor after the prophecy. They would have expected the same to possibly happen with the kingship. Malcolm suggests that it won't. This works as a vaulter for Macbeth's character as well. It's a turning point. There's a new problem in the way now. And does this potentially push him further along the road to regicide? Shakespeare uses a simile as Duncan praises Malcolm. The whole atmosphere in the scene is quite jarring. Duncan's really positive and he comes across as a fair, generous and warm king. But there's an undertone, and that's revolving around Macbeth's inner thoughts and what they could possibly lead to. Duncan then confirms that he will go to Inverness. He will go to Macbeth's castle to affirm their bond and become even closer, possibly in reflection of that prosperous future that he's just promised. The sense of dramatic irony really builds the tension here. Duncan will be vulnerable inside Macbeth's castle. The audience know what Macbeth is planning. In one sense, the perfect opportunity has presented itself. Macbeth responds in a positive tone. He promises Duncan he will have a joyful stay at his castle. However, the audience who are aware of his true intentions would be concerned for the king's well-being. We're then introduced to Lady Macbeth, and there's potentially some foreshadowing here due to the point at which she's introduced. That word again, worthy. It's been repeated so many times already at this point. It's almost a constant in the comparison between Macbeth and MacDonald. The repetition of it here is incredibly powerful, as the audience would already be considering Macbeth's possible treachery, which will reflect and even overshadow that of MacDonald. Then we get Macbeth's real response to the news. His real response to the news of Malcolm becoming Duncan's heir, it's revealed through another well-placed aside. He reveals his view of Malcolm as an obstacle that he must overcome if he is to become king. There doesn't seem to be much doubt in his mind here. He will have to overcome Malcolm because he will become king. But there is a sense that he's struggling with what he will have to do. He dehumanises Malcolm to his title as the Prince of Cumberland. Does this make the action easier, as it feels as if he isn't doing it to an actual person? I'd argue for that point of view, I think, especially considering how he reacts later. This is then reflected in his next line. The idea of stars is obviously linked to destiny and fate, but Macbeth wants to ignore this, and he wants to follow what the witches have prophesied for him. He is choosing evil over good, choosing the darkness over the light. He knows what he is considering, or maybe even planning by this stage. He knows it is wrong. He knows that he must keep his desires hidden. He knows the repercussions if he doesn't will be very severe, but he appears not to care. But he does seem slightly sickened by the act itself. He almost can't bear to think about it. And this is mirrored later in the play when it comes time to make the choice of acting or not. And then finally, after Macbeth has left, Duncan addresses Banquo. Shakespeare really pours the dramatic irony on now. Duncan exclaims about how valiant Macbeth is and how welcome Duncan will surely feel at their castle. He, unlike the audience, has absolutely no idea what may possibly await him there. And there we go. Duncan sets off for Inverness, following in Macbeth's trail, and the audience hold their collective breath, concerned for the king's well-being, worried about Macbeth's actions and eager to meet his wife, Lady Macbeth. This scene has really developed the idea that Macbeth may well turn to regicide in order to accelerate the prophecies of the witches. We have learned that Malcolm is to become king after Duncan, and we know that Macbeth cannot and possibly will not allow that to happen. Again, even though they're not present in this scene, the prophecies of the witches hang heavy over the heads of Macbeth and Banquo, and the spectre of death appears to not be too far in King Duncan's future. If you've got any extra notes at this point that you think would be useful, same as usual, please add them to your scripts. Also, feel free to add them in the comment section below. I'd really like to see what you think of the impression we're getting of Macbeth at this point and how you feel about what's going on in the play. And please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel. You can find us over on Instagram at OpenBookPC. I'll see you next time to meet with Lady Macbeth and with Destiny itself at Macbeth's Castle in Act 1, Scene 5.